Burton Dreben is our guest in this panel discussion with Professor Quine. He is Edgar Pierce Emeritus Professor at Harvard University and Professor of Philosophy at Boston University. He has published in the areas of logic, mathematical logic, and the rise of analytic philosophy, and has co-authored The Decision Problem with Warren Goldfarb. He has been a long-time colleague of Professor Quine, and their friendship and philosophical proximity are well known. George Boolos replaces our regular panelist, Paul Horwich, for this discussion. In this program, Professor Quine defends his critique of modality and provides an explanation of his characterization of logic. He then clearly expounds his ontological position and discusses his view of and his association with the historical development of logic. Quine also gives his opinion of Tarski's famous work on truth and finally offers his prescription for how much logic the philosopher should be aware of. We go now to Cambridge, Massachusetts to join the discussion. Joining Professor Quine for this discussion are Burton Dreben, Emeritus Professor at Harvard University and Professor of Philosophy at Boston University, George Boolos, Professor of Philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Martin Davies, Wild Reader in Mental Philosophy at Oxford University. George, would you begin the discussion?
Professor Quine, you were well known for your critique of the notion of analyticity, as well as your critique of, indeed, attack on the kindred notion of modality, that is, the joint notion of necessity and possibility. Let me ask you how you would respond to the following question. Could 1 million have been less than 7?
I think my response to that should be the same as to any question that of the form of any question that asked whether a given mathematical truth could be false or could have been false. There are two aspects to that question. One is what do we do about this modal construction itself, which doesn't reduce to, which doesn't even fit into elementary standard logic, quantification theory, and truth function logic. My answer to that part is that I would raise the level by what I call semantic assent, that is A-S-C-E-N-T, and talk about the symbols. Then I would say that that sentence, whose truth value is being discussed, is mathematically true. Mathematically true, and there's and that is something that we might regard as falling under the heading of necessary truth. And what constitutes its necessity, in my view, is that although mathematics, particularly when we get up, here we are already in number theory in your example. What makes mathematical truth so firm, as I see it, from my holistic point of view, is that when a bundle of hypotheses that has critical mass, in the sense of implying possibility of observational test, implying a connection between two observable situations. When it has critical mass in that sense, it will, chances are, contain not only some sentences of a obviously empirical kind, and some sentences of a completely trivial sort that wouldn't go in practice, that would go without saying, but it would also contain some mathematical laws. When the empirical test then shows that chunk of science is untenable, it implies a connection of observables that doesn't meet the experimental test. Then we know that one or another of the component sentences in that bundle has got to be rejected. We have to start over at that point. And then the question is which one to reject which one the removal of which one might be might turn out to be most opportune in the way of subsequent developments and suggestion of subsequent hypotheses. And our practice is not to disturb the mathematical terms, the mathematical components of that bundle of sentences. Leave the mathematical truths as they are. And why is that our policy? I think it's just the pragmatic matter that upsetting mathematics has such far-reaching ramifications throughout all parts of science that it rocks the boat unnecessarily. We try, in general, to regard it as good strategy to minimize our revisions.
A follow-up question on a related topic that I wanted to ask is this: you have been even more strenuously opposed to quantified modal logic than you are to the notion, the ordinary, to the notion of necessity as applied in propositional logic. Could you say a word about what you find so particularly objectionable about quantifying in? First of all, I think perhaps would you say what quantifying in is and say why it's such a bad thing?
Yes. You have a modal operator. It is necessary that which covers a certain segment of text, and you have a variable turning up in that segment of text, which is governed by a quantifier which is outside that segment. It's something that leads to trouble, or at least to quandaries, problems, in the modal logic of necessity, also in the logic of propositional attitudes. The de re propositional attitudes, which I reject as an acceptable part of a scientific endeavor, leaving only the de dicto ones. That's an example. The difficulty being in those cases and the necessity case of in the case of the propositional attitudes, because of a mixing of the ontology of the man in the attitude with the man who's attributing the attitude. In the case of modal logic, on the other hand, the difficulty it presents is different. Namely, it leads to essentialism, and I find essentialism philosophically unwelcome. Because if you can quantify into necessity context, then you can say, in particular, you can say for any chosen predicate f, you can say for all x, or necessarily fx, or perhaps for some x, necessarily fx. Therefore, there is something which is essential to any object fulfilling the predicate f. Whereas, from my point of view, all attributes are logically on a par and shared on an equal footing by all the denoted objects. From the point of view of logical algorithm, the effect of quantifying in, which makes it unwelcome, or at least complicated matter, both in the propositional attitudes and in the case of modal logic of necessity, is that if you take a special instance of the quantified variable and draw instances, you can get contrary results depending on what term, what name you use to specify the object. In many cases, you don't have the in the position of a variable when that variable is supplanted by an instance, a term, a constant. You don't have substitutivity of identity. Frege's familiar example of evening star and morning star is a case of this.
I take it this is the real objection, that do you want to say that it makes no sense to assign an object to a variable in a formula in the scope of a box, the sign of necessity? That is, there's no saying whether the number 9 is necessarily odd, apart from the way in which you refer to the number 9. If you refer to it as the number 9, you call it the number 9, then when you substitute that name in, you get something that's plausibly true. When you substitute the number of the planets in, you get something that's plausibly false. But is it your view, then, that there's no sense at all in saying of a certain number, regardless of how it's described, that it's necessarily even?
Exactly, yes.
So the problem then isn't quantifying in so much as the idea of assigning objects to variables in formulas, beginning with a box.
Yes, yes. What I've called referential position.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Could you say a little bit more about why that notion makes no sense? Why we can't discuss the question whether 9 is necessarily odd? Why is that?
Because the number of the planets is not necessarily odd from the point of view, that is, of people who accept the notion of necessity. And there's another aspect of this whole problem, because I go farther in this case, unlike the case of propositional attitudes, and find no place for a concept of necessity in the sense of it being a concept to do a logic about. I understand necessity as the use of the adverb necessarily. It's clear enough to suit me when it's used as we ordinarily use it, which is always something relative to the particular situation of our discourse. Necessarily this because, well, as we saw in the preceding page, in contrast to what I'm about to try to justify, such context, or necessarily in the sense that, well, both parties to the discussion agree to that much, but what we're wondering about then from there on. So I don't feel the attraction of trying to rig up modal logic of necessity or any other logic of necessity in such a way as to get around these difficulties. I have felt that need in the case of the propositional attitudes, which are so indispensable, and I've been comforted by having been able at least to cut that domain in half and accept, in my extensional scheme, the de dicto versions. But in the case of necessity, I haven't found it something to worry about at all. There is, I might say, in fact, this work of yours, George, showing that that the structure of modal logic, that formal system, if you get simply dispense with these debatable interpretations, the suspicious or uncomfortable notion of necessity, give another interpretation to the symbols, you get something which you've been finding is useful in the mathematical treatment of mathematical proofs. Well, good. It's nice to be able to find a useful byproduct.
So it is somewhat ironic that something that was designed to study a notion that you, at any rate, would regard as not scientifically respectable has turned out to be illuminating in one of the central areas of logic. That is ironic and gratifying to me, at any rate. Yes. Could you say a little bit more about your preference for the notions of intentionality over those of necessity? Is it just notions like belief, desire, hope, no, the rest of them are just so indispensable that they have to be accommodated somehow?
That's it.
Professor Quine, I wonder if I can just follow up George Boolos's question by asking this. Is it more that there's some purely logical problem about modality, or more that you have no use for the notion? Let me put it this way. Supposing that somebody thought they did have a use for the notion and looked at the semantics of modal logic and then offered a completely realistic construal of the possible world semantics in the way that David Lewis does. Now, you might find this populating of our ontology with further worlds similar in character to us and all our surroundings. You might find that a very, very bold empirical conjecture. In fact, you might find it one that you thought was false. Would there be actually any logical problem?
No, I think not. Yes, you put your finger on it. I would feel it's not worth the price. So this would have to be the discovery of some really very profound and important utility of necessity to justify all that.
Thank you.
Okay. Van, I wanted to ask some questions about the nature of logic and the boundaries that separate logic, properly so called, from other areas of inquiry. In 1940, you published a book with the title Mathematical Logic, in which you set forth a system of set theory. Later on, your view was, or later on you expressed the view that logic is pretty much to be identified with what's called the first-order predicate calculus, with quantification theory. Was there any change of view between 1940 and your, say, post-war writings on the nature of logic?
No, I think not. The situation was rather this. The tradition coming down from Frege through Russell, of course, Russell and Whitehead had been my main introduction to the whole domain, and then continuing through Carnap, all these were using the term logic inclusively to include all of set theory, and therefore, in view of the reduction of the rest of mathematics to set theory, which Russell and Whitehead had undertaken to establish, all mathematics, so that all mathematics was reduced to logic, so-called. Already in mathematical logic, I found more recently, in looking back, I make the point that something to this effect, that because of this, that, and the other, that the term that one might well consider that the term logic is appropriately to be restricted to that lower level and separated from mathematics. So I felt it should, but I was bowing to what was for me traditional usage. I thought it was just necessary to point out that there are really fundamental differences there that break at the end of quantification theory and identity. But then, of course, I continued to feel that way, and by the time I was doing methods of logic, 10 years later, I suited the action to the word.
I'm wondering if there's anything to be said, if you think there's anything useful to be said on the topic of why certain notions count as distinctively logical notions. Many writers, such as Gilbert Ryle, have pointed out that logic seems to enjoy something that he happily, I think, called topic neutrality. Other writers have pointed to the fact that logical notions occur in all sorts of discourse, thought, speech, writing. Can't say anything really without using logical notions. Is there anything sensible to be said on this matter?
Yes, I think so. The second view is expressed by Tarski. And yes, I agree with them. I think that's part of what distinguishes logic. Another trait of logic that I find characteristic is what I've called potential obviousness, that everything valid is either valid on sight or can be made to be seen as valid by a series of steps, each of which is valid, each of which is obvious on sight.
But that brings up a very interesting question. Logic is potentially obvious in your sense, that is, that each valid formula can be, a valid statement can be seen to be valid by means of starting from obvious steps, by means of obvious, yes. Starting from obvious premises by means of obvious steps. But what about the invalid ones? Logic doesn't have, there's no procedure for showing invalid formulas to be invalid. Why the emphasis on showing the valid ones to be valid? Why stress valid rather than invalid?
Why? Well, now, just consider what the most basic uses of logic are. The basic use, I think, is a deduction of consequences. And this is on the positive side, and this is the thing that admits of that is potentially obvious. There's the basic utility of it. Finding here, you make some discoveries. You want to broaden your knowledge. You draw the logical consequences. In the case of invalidity, it doesn't even pay off as well, because if you show that the deduction of something from some premises is invalid, you still haven't shown it's false.
Certainly not.
But if you show that the deduction is valid, then you show that it's true, having in both cases assumed that the starting point was true. Another trait of logic is that I think that in my this isn't a trait exclusively of logic, but in the narrow or the obvious sense of analyticity that I suggested in terms of reference, logic is emphatically analytic. When someone makes an obvious logical fallacy at the elementary level, where it can't be attributed merely to the complexity of the formula, we put it down directly. If he's being serious, we put it down to his not having learned the language adequately. He doesn't know how to use and, or he doesn't know how to use or properly. There's just no separating the two. And so this seems to me as analyticity par excellence. And that's not at all the case when you get up into higher realms in set theory.
I wonder whether the criterion or the diagnostic of obviousness doesn't include too much within the domain of logic. I suppose it's obvious that all flesh decays.
No, that this is black.
Or that this is black.
Yes,
but we wouldn't want to include these within the domain of logic. But then when you give some further criterion to sort out the right sort of obvious from the obviousness from the wrong sort of obviousness, one just wonders what sorts of resources are going to be used there.
Yes. Now, certainly obviousness is not a sufficient condition for being logical. Right. Obviously, there have been black dogs, whether there are now or not. That's an example I've used for that purpose. No, obviousness, potential obviousness is, however, a trait that that logic, in what I think of as the proper narrow sense, enjoys, and set theory does not. And so that's part of my reason for the cleavage between the two.
Right. Is there anything more that you can say by way of moving us towards necessary and sufficient conditions for falling within the domain of logic?
No. No, I don't think I've been able to do more there than what amounts to enumeration. I remember Tarski raising the same question. I think maybe he had a wider domain than logic in my narrow sense in mind, but either way, he gave up on it too. You specify logic for your purposes by that logical truths, by embracing all those sentences that contain terms of just this vocabulary, essentially, and you enumerate the vocabulary.
Wouldn't you say, Van, that what you've just said is the crucial difference between you and Carnap with regard to analyticity and the nature of logic? Namely, that you're not going to give any necessary sufficient condition, whereas Carnap thought he could. And,
yes,
then the whole point comes down to the fact that you're not going to give any characterization of a logical constants. You're simply going to list them without giving any particular properties of them.
Quite, yes.
So, that's
good.
the basic difference.
Yes, that's Tarski as opposed to Carnap.
Exactly, and you're on Tarski's side.
Mightn't there be some principles of set theory that are, well, if not absolutely as obvious as some of the elementary principles of logic, which, by the way, it's often quite difficult to state properly, are almost as obvious? I'm thinking, for example, of a principle that I know you're fond of, the axiom of extensionality, which says that two sets are equal if they have the same members. If you've got sets, x and y, and everything that belongs to x belongs to y, and vice versa, then x is the same set as y. Isn't that about as obvious as any principle of logic?
Yes, it is obvious, and I wouldn't. Maybe something I said a minute ago suggests the opposite or implies the opposite. But no, I don't think I would take potential obviousness as a sufficient condition even for separating the logic from the set theory. Similarly, for another consideration that separates the two, namely logic, in the sense in which I prefer the term, is complete. Of course, that's, well, that's of a piece with potential obviousness. Set theory is not. But nevertheless, there are subdivisions of set theory that are complete. And then another point that should certainly be, we should remind ourselves of it, is that we who work in these things, set theory seriously, tend to lose sight of, namely the widespread conception of what counts as set theory, even among a good many mathematicians, surely in other parts of mathematics, are really just another way of writing elementary logic, namely Boolean algebra. Boolean algebra with its usual interpretation of being an algebra of sets or classes, and that is just a way of rendering elementary logic which doesn't talk about sets of classes at all. That's a needless hypothesis until you get up beyond the limits of what I'm regarding as logic. So that, and of course, when we take that more popular view of set theory, it's the notion of set theory that the proponents in America some years ago of the so-called new mathematics, a movement for getting a certain amount of logic into the elementary schools, called set theory. But it's just this, it's just very elementary logic. So the matter of demarcation of logic from mathematics rests on a number of considerations, traits of the domains as wholes. Set theory as a whole, not completable, logic as a whole, and again, that which is the same as potentially obvious in the end. Another one is that logic, in my sense, is neutral in its ontology. The variables can range over anything and everything. Applying it, you may or may not limit the range of variables as you please, but there's nothing intrinsically logical, intrinsically logical in the ontology. But as soon as you get into set theory, you're talking about some very specific kind of things, namely the sets. So here's another trait in which they differ, and it's this sort of consideration that has made me think of that boundary as the very natural place to draw a boundary to conform to explicate, so to speak, the popular or general, anyway, widespread uses of these two terms, logic and mathematics. Here's George Boolos here has produced quite an unsettling result in this connection, namely that he's shown that the lower level of what I call set theory, namely the theory of classes of individuals, excluding classes of classes, but just classes of individuals, classes of non-classes, can be organized in such a way that it's recognizably just a regimentation of the use of plurals in ordinary language, you'd think surely we wouldn't want to regard our ordinary use of plurals when we're talking about sticks and stones and the like as discourse about abstract objects, among other things, namely sets or classes. So this certainly set me back on my heels. What about this? My first reaction is, well, now here are two interesting places to draw the line rather than one. Well, then this new place of drawing the line fails of one of my two considerations, namely the completability. In other words, potential obviousness. Because as soon as you make that further step and bring in classes of individuals without restriction, you've overstepped completability. So that's a loss. And furthermore, when we do think of that domain of sets, lowest level, as a domain of sets, rather than a regimentation of plurals, it goes so nicely and continuously with the rest of set theory, where the further steps are brought in. So as I say, my first reaction was, well, here are two worthwhile, interesting criteria. Then finally, I did settle down, and I settled down in my old position. But the suspense must have been terrific. The way I see it now is that yes, we're talking about abstract objects when we get over into the first order set theory. But what George's discovery shows us is that that's not so nefarious from a nominalistic point of view, the point of view of those who deplore abstract objects at all and think we can get along without them. If we take my line on all this, we can't get along without them, and probably can't anyway, but not so bad. Really, it's just as innocent as our ordinary vernacular use of plurals. It's just that we see now that, although it didn't show on the surface, that our vernacular use of plurals does presuppose abstract objects, namely sets of individuals.
Well, I'm not going to rejoin.
I'd like to hear the rejoinder sometime.
Yeah, well, I think about it, but I want to not on camera.
I want to ask on this point, why is it the question of any interest? You see, there's a tremendous literature that has grown up about whether you have changed with regard to logic, the original question that George asked. I have never seen any interest in that question. Once one appreciates the force of your movement against the tradition, which culminates in your criticisms of Carnap, but it's criticisms of Frege, criticisms of Russell, are all the same in this regard. That is, once you insist that there's no really interesting distinction between mathematics and logic on one side and physics on the other, i.e. what you're really doing is attacking the idea that there's any real interest to the notion of a priori knowledge. That's what's really going on. Then it doesn't matter at all, except in some kind of ordinary textbook sense, dictionary sense, whether you're going to have the more extended sense of logic or the more narrow sense. All these distinctions you're pointing out are valuable for some purposes, but the underlying philosophical thrust has already been won by you.
Yes, well...
And so I really don't see why, and that's why I interrupted before, obviousness, potential obviousness, is never given as an explanatory criterion or a necessary and sufficient condition. It's simply a trait. And indeed, the most interesting discussion of this is Carnap's own reaction to that when Quine first proposes this in the Schilp volume on Quine, and Carnap's reply to Carnap and Logical Truth, where Carnap couldn't understand what Van was saying. He takes for granted that the use of obvious, or potential obvious, when it's applied to logic or math, has to have a different character.
It's the Schilp volume on Carnap.
The Schilp volume on Carnap, yeah. Where you had your great paper. And so I'm interested in asking George, or you, or someone, why is this a question of any interest beyond making a decision that I want to restrict logic to first-order logic?
I second that question with this in mind, that my old hankering for a nominalistic basis for science and for everything has certainly dwindled. First of all, there was the hankering, but I decided it was impossible. But then I even lost that because of the indeterminacy of reference.
Exactly.
And now I see the ontology as just a matter of tagging the various nodes in our overall structure.
Can I get in here with a remark that I'm very sympathetic to this question too, but I would want to say that there are lots of distinctions to be drawn in logic between the propositional calculus and monadic logic, or even monadic logic with identity, which is decidable between that and dyadic logic, between first-order predicate calculus in the full form and what's called second-order logic, between second-order logic and the rest of set theory, which I see as a very important break, or between second-order logic and higher-order logic, and then between higher-order logic and full set theory. The point is, there seem within logic to be, and this is quite characteristic of the subject, there seem to be lots of divisions. I mean, one has, so to speak...
What philosophical interest have these divisions? Sure, these are technically very interesting.
It depends on what the division is. Surely there are going to be philosophically interesting distinctions between propositional calculus and monadic logic.
I'm not sure. One would have to explain what one means by the philosophic interest.
The second difference that I mentioned, namely having a particular subject matter, which logic in my sense doesn't have. Of course, there, prima facie, the boundary should remain where I put it, because a second-order logic, or bottom layer set theory, has its ontology, namely the sets. But that is not that's a somewhat question-begging consideration, since if we proceed from the point of view of George's discovery, we might say, oh yes, but you're not really talking about those sets of individuals, so that there's not that ontological demarcation between logic as being ontology-free and set theory being ontology-ridden. So it may be, as you suggested, that it's the matter of potential obviousness that is the main cutoff point there.
it's really a continuing the same thing, because the way the questions have come about now, up to now, it looks as if ontological questions have some real force or point. And it's certainly true that Van, in the early papers, certainly in the 30s and even through the 40s, in the great paper of 48 on what there is, seems to suggest that ontological questions are of interest. But I think it's fair to say, and he, I think, said so just a few moments ago, that during the passage of time, so-called ontological questions have dwindled in interest until now, and that was partly behind my question about what's the interest in the distinction. Now, I don't want to keep pursuing this because George didn't want to keep going. But there are many kinds of distinctions to be drawn. George started listing them, and they have all kinds of interesting technical, logical, and so forth. But for me, none of them are of philosophical interest, but that can be a private discussion later on. But for Van, I think, and now he has to speak to this shift of emphasis until in the recent maybe the last 4 or 5 years, in several papers, and in Pursuit of Truth, and then some papers that are about to come out, the only point of an object is to permit a smooth-running logical inference. Van is practically giving up on having any interest in object as such. If you just take what he says and focus narrowly, it looks like he's becoming almost like Fichte, an idealist, an extreme idealist. That's not the way to read him, of course. But this is what it looks like in many of the most interesting recent papers and in the book, Pursuit of Truth. And this is what comes out of taking ontological relativity or the inscrutability of reference seriously. And I think Van should speak to this, whether there is any interest that remains in so-called ontology or ontological questions.
The kind of interest that I see remaining is just an aspect of in general, the interest in getting a more economical, more elegant formulation of a theory. And the range of values of variables, a homogeneous range, for instance, rather than the basic separation into categories, abstract versus concrete, for instance. Or getting everything consolidated into, everything concrete consolidated into sets of quadruples of numbers, and eliminating in that way all bodies, everything in space-time, in favor of the coordinates of the portions of space-time that they occupy. Then you just have that one domain, the domain of sets of numbers and others. That's the kind of interest that would remain, I think. Someone, in general, getting rid of a hidden variation where your ostensible objects are, to some extent, indistinguishable within the terms of the theory. Or a crude example I use somewhere, a little chunk of economic theory where you're talking about people, but you're talking about people only with respect to their income. And so that as far as anything expressible in the terms of the theory is concerned, people with the same income, references to them are interchangeable. All right, change the ontology. Ontology is income groups rather than people. That sort of thing, which is just a matter of details of scientific style. I think that's all I see.
In what theory would one draw the distinction between abstract and concrete?
Certainly not in the theory that I suggested about reinterpreting bodies. Of course, one would in a theory that was set up in the theory of types as a logic and set theory for it. I'd put a premium always on, of course, on pooling them and handling them. I do handle them as all as values of the same variables.
Exactly.
Yes. I didn't go along with Ryle with his categories. Different meanings of existence for different categories.
One might say it's a constant shifting from ontology to ideology, to use another favorite term of yours. That what are the predicates take much more precedence than what you're arranging over.
Good. Yes. Yes, it's the lexicon of predicates
that matter.
That's where the strength of this theory lies.
One way in which one could indicate the unimportance of ontology relative to other questions is that you always held, I believe, that ontological questions couldn't even arise with regard to a decidable theory, a theory for which you had a decision procedure.
Good, yes.
And you've also held, I believe, they couldn't arise in any way that is of any interest unless the theory was going to have either an infinite domain, an infinite universe of discourse, or at least an indefinitely open universe of discourse, which again goes against, seems to me, what traditionally and for many people have been the point of ontological questions. They certainly wouldn't have thought that because, for instance, let's say elementary geometry or elementary reals is a decidable theory, and if that's the only thing you ever needed to use to do physics, say, we don't, but let's assume you did, then there would be no ontological questions raised about numbers at all.
Yes.
And that, I think, very few people have appreciated in you.
Yes, if you have a decidable theory, then you could define set up a recursive definition so that every sentence, according as it was true or false by your decision procedure, was defined as equivalent to 0 equals 0 or 0 equals 1. And then you would have just two sentences. All the rest would be elaborate notations for the same thing, and there'd be no variables there that you'd want to assign values to, or no call for an ontology. And then the other situation, that's the situation where you have a decision procedure. The situation where you have just a finite universe, and you know how many things there are, and you've got you know every one of them. You've got a name for every one. Then again, you don't need quantification. Truth functions are enough to take care of quantification. You want to affirm something of all $1,000,005 things that there are. You just put down it's just a predicate P that you're applying to all of them. You just, if you've given them numerals as names, you just express that whole universal assertion as P1 and P2 and P3 and P4 and so on to the end of the line. So ontology is pointless except in the case of infinite or indefinite universes. And then comes the indeterminacy of reference, that even there, it doesn't matter what the ontology is, just anything within one-to-one correlation with anything else will do as well.
Let me follow up on that. That's a very curious position, Van, that you... It seems to be a very curious position that you've advocated because, as is, fairly well known, arithmetic without multiplication is decidable. I think that's an old theorem due to Pressburger.
Pressburger, good.
Yeah.
And however, of course, if you add if you add on multiplication, so that you have arithmetic with addition and multiplication, that theory is undecidable. So it would seem that we need. We're now involved in genuine questions of ontology when we have both addition and multiplication, whereas with just addition we don't, and yet it would seem we're talking about the same things. How could there not be an ontological question in the first
Yes,
case?
good. Certainly, in practice, we what I've maintained is that we use quantification and are justified in using quantification even where it wouldn't have been needed by these considerations, because we're dealing with that domain as a fragment of a more inclusive domain where we need it. In this case, arithmetic. As for the strangeness of suddenly having to reify, I think is diminished when we think again in terms of the inscrutability of reference, which brings out that the role of quantifiers and hence of ontology at all is in strengthening the logical connections that run through a system and enable you finally to relate your theory to observation sentences. And some theories are so weak that the unreinforced logical connections, just truth functions, are enough to make those connections. Because now I'm thinking of the whole ontology as just a device for linking up sentences with sentences.
Mm-hmm. The question, what is there, what the theory is about, ceases to have the same sort of force or content any longer. I mean, it's a relative question depending of the strength of the theory, of what really is happening for deduction, for inference. The holism has become far more powerful than ever before. That's what's really happening. Mm-hmm. And the local questions cease to have the force they apparently had.
I'd like to ask a question about the epistemic status of parts of mathematics. Let's think first of all about the parts of mathematics which seem not to have any great role to play in science. So you often speak of these clumps of sentences which achieve a certain critical mass by having observational consequences, and you spoke of the cases in which mathematical sentences would find their place in those clumps, but it seems also you said that there would be some parts of mathematics which would very rarely or never have a role to play there. How would we assess whether we should accept certain parts of certain proposals for mathematical sentences or other proposals for mathematical sentences where they're not going to play a role in science?
Yes, good. That's a question that has worried me. And the position I've come to is this. The reason those sentences seem intelligible to us and seem to want investigation is that they are built up from the same vocabulary, mathematical vocabulary, by the same grammatical constructions as the part of mathematics that is needed in application to science. We might like to cut down on all our commitments there and narrow our field of investigation explicitly by rendering all the rest of these matters inexpressible. But to do that would entail a forbiddingly complex mutilation and gerrymandering, cutting away of sentences as meaningless without our being able to give a straightforward, relatively simple grammatical definition of well-formed sentence. So we find it more practical to let all these things in. Then, that being the case, two questions arise. One, how far to let that go? How far must it extend? Well, of course, no farther than the requisite, what seems to be the requisite grammar entails. But there's the further question: since we are admitting these sentences, inapplicable though they are, what's going to count? What's going to count them as true or false? Well, of course, we would say demonstrability, and the demonstrability would be the basis for the truth, and demonstrability, that would be by the very rules that are also needed in carrying out the practical applicable mathematics. However, that doesn't quite do the trick, because Gödel has shown that you can't have a complete proof procedure even for the applicable part of mathematics, the very applicable, namely number theory. So how do we decide? There are a few famous mathematical formulations up in set theory, up higher set theory, where there's no thought of application, axiom of choice and continuum hypothesis, where you can't prove these from familiar accepted bases of set theory, even the ones that are the bases that are formulated. How to decide? They must be true or false. I mean, by the commitments or fictions that govern our whole logical apparatus that we're accepting. My preference there, my line, is to say that those cases can be settled more or less satisfactorily, one after another, some of them anyway, by the same sorts of considerations by which we make decisions out in natural science, in the very theoretical reaches where you can't get anything in the way of a empirical test, even indirectly, but you still have to settle one way or another how to count it in order to round out the theory, namely considerations of simplicity are the characteristic thing, so the maximum economy of ontology compatible with the maximum economy of theory, structure. There are various places that we could draw the line with that in mind, and there's something in particular in 1940, some theory that Gödel developed, which does give us a very inviting cutoff point, something that he called a constructibility, a trait of certain sets. That familiar, intelligible enough name doesn't really make this intelligible, because it's a very special application of the word. But anyway, this is something that a standard that gives us everything we could conceivably want to apply and a bit more. But it has the advantage of being a neat cutoff, and below that we don't see any. Namely, to adopt an axiom, there's an even quite a laconic a formulation of the axiom, 3 characters, namely V equals L, which does this. So Gödel's axiom, it isn't an axiom that Gödel accepts, it's an axiom that, or rejects, it's an axiom that it's a proposition, it's a formula that he gives and explores, but I would adopt it as a postulate.
Can I just ask?
There should be added here, I think, that you are, in this regard, very, very much in the minority. Almost no set theorist favors adoption of V equals L as an axiom. One notable exception may be Ronald Jensen of Oxford University, but apart from that, I don't know of anyone. There may be some, of course, but by and large, set theorists reject L, and they regard it now as almost obviously false.
Yeah. It spoils their fun.
A lot of their games.
It spoils their fun, exactly.
Exactly. It's just verifies Van's point.
I wanted to ask whether in the outer reaches of set theory, where you said along the way in your answer that you would advert to considerations of simplicity, for example, whether it's best to think of simplicity as a guide to the truth or as constituting the truth in those cases.
Yes. I don't think I can distinguish that once we get that far out. Just as when we're way in at the other extreme, at the most obvious, the truth functions and the like, I can't distinguish between what's a change of logical theory and what's a change of terminology and semantics interpretation.
I also wanted to ask a question about the epistemic status of the more workaday parts of mathematics. Just take any very, very simple statement like 2 + 2 = 4. There are philosophers concerned about epistemology who worry about the following. In epistemology, even in naturalized epistemology, the notion that is appealed to a very great deal is causation. Some kind of causal transaction seems to be involved in our arriving at knowledge. But mathematical objects, being abstract objects, plausibly don't participate in causal transactions. So how can we know even such simple truths as that 2 + 2 = 4? What would you say to these philosophers?
Well, of course, a first thought is to board John Stuart Mill's boat, at least for the duration of this bit, empirically by putting apples in separate piles, experimenting. That particular example.
I wanted to go back to the distinction between the propositional calculus and the predicate calculus, or quantification theory as it's sometimes called. You once wrote, I quote almost verbatim, "Logic is an ancient subject, and since 1879 it has been a great one." 1879 was the year in which Frege published his monograph called the Begriffsschrift, which means conceptual notation. But there had been a lot of very interesting work in logic done before 1879. Boole, in 1847, published his mathematical analysis of logic. A number of philosophers have wondered, wondered whether your remark doesn't slight Boole. How would you?
Yes, Boole, when I was first becoming acquainted with this subject, Boole was regarded as the father of modern logic. And I took that as gospel. But in later years, when I came to know Frege's contributions and more about the history of the thing, it struck me that what he accomplished there is such a major leap that if a boundary is going to be drawn but in the progress of logic between, or in this case, to get back to George's quotation, if we're going to decide where the greatness set in, I would put it there, because we have more continuity before that. There's a lot, as Łukasiewicz showed, there was a good deal in the along the truth functional line already among the ancient Stoics. And then coming down through the Middle Ages, Petrus Hispanus and Paul of Venice and others who were dealing with that and making further short steps forward, and then Leibniz doing a bit more, getting on closer to Boole's Boolean algebra, so that you have a relatively minor science, not a great science, but still one that is alive and very slowly progressing along the way. And it seems to me that when Boole comes on the scene, along with De Morgan and Charles Sanders Peirce shortly after, that you don't have a sudden turn upward. It's just more modest progress, and I think the decisive point is 1879.
I think Peirce was actually doing things very, very close to what Frege was doing then. It might have been a year or so after Frege actually did it.
Exactly, it was.
He did, but I don't think he was influenced by Frege.
No, he wasn't. And that, yes, that's just from point of view of Peirce's interest. That's a sad accident. He at that time, it seems clear, knew nothing of Frege, and he had been, and one can trace this through Peirce's writings and also his Nachlass, the succession of steps that finally led to the great breakthrough on Peirce's part, which constituted the founding of quantification, which is what we're thinking of as the big turning point that's turned logic into a great subject. You can follow that through in a way that you can't for Frege, because Frege's Begriffsschrift came full grown from Frege's brow. But Peirce finally hit it independently, as you say, of Frege, and it was just a couple of years later. I forget, maybe 3 years, I think of 1882, that he's got something that is the real thing. Yeah. And in Peirce's case, furthermore, we have this interesting prehistory within Peirce of the thought process. So this is, picking 79 is just a matter of respecting the public prints.
It is noteworthy that in Frege's Begriffsschrift, which was the work of 1879, does contain a full-blown system of second-order logic. Not only did he come forth with the real thing, he came forth with something which may be the irreal or the surreal thing as well. I mean, he did actually produce a system of second-order logic and prove some very, very deep theorems in it as well. It's an amazing work, which I think we're only now coming fully to understand.
Yeah, there's another plug for your finding about plurals.
Well, yes.
But can I say one thing? The Peirce certainly had the quantifier, gets it out of the algebra of logic as he develops. It's not clear, though, that he had what you might call a full system. That is, there are no precise rules.
Oh,
it's
good.
entirely
good.
semantical or quasi-semantical.
Oh, yes.
And it's not clear that he even had rules for turning things into prenex, the so-called rules of passage, explicitly. This was so foreign to him.
Yeah.
So there is in the sense that we think of logic and the whole notion of a formal system, that clearly is Frege.
Oh, yes,
And
good.
that in some ways is far more important, because Frege truly is the grandfather of the computer, and what you see in the Begriffsschrift is the first truly programming language.
Yeah, so that's very
That's
controlling.
very important.
It makes it not such a near miss, and says a heartbreaking near miss on Peirce's part.
It's a totally different attitude and the whole approach, and you couldn't. A great deal belongs to on the other. But to continue with what George said, of course, for Frege, the distinction between first order and second order didn't exist. It was not a serious matter for him. For him, he's the one who really gives us the idea of logic in the biggest sense, and that's from which you came, of course, originally.
Yes, even set theory, naive set theory.
Yes, he doesn't even think in any other terms. Nor did Russell until much later.
Well, now that we've gotten into the history of the subject a little bit, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about your own early years, the years with Carnap and Tarski in Warsaw. I'm particularly interested in the question of the Gödel incompleteness theorems, which had just come out, had they not, when you first went to Europe to study. Would you tell us a little bit about the connection?
Just a year before. Yeah. I don't know when I first got the news. I think it was before I got to Europe, but it couldn't have been much before. I can't remember its ringing any bell in the philosophy department at Harvard, or much less the mathematics department.
How much contact did you have with the circle of logicians in Princeton once you got back to the United States? You were up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and there was an active group of people
Yes.
in New York and Princeton.
Yes, well, there was enough contact, so it was quite significant for me, pretty promptly. In fact, well, it was in 1936 that the first issue of the Journal of Symbolic Logic came out under Church's direction, and that was the outcome of the formation of the Association for Symbolic Logic in 1935, and that had been, well, Church and Curry had been the prime movers there of an organizational kind, but various of us had been drawn in on the discussions. 35, maybe even 34.
But it sounds as if, say, the Gödel incompleteness theorems, which by my lights are perhaps some of the greatest logical, certainly by anybody's lights, some of the greatest logical discoveries since Aristotle, were rather slow in being assimilated. Is that right?
Well, perhaps so. The question of how widely. There's a story about John von Neumann, who was at that time teaching at Berlin and giving a seminar, and the news had just broken then. However he got it, in what form he got it, I don't know, but it was right there in 31 when Gödel's, well, maybe just when his paper appeared. But anyway, it was...
No, he got it. It was in September of 1930 at the conference at Königsberg when Gödel announced the result.
Oh, that was it.
And von Neumann was sitting right there. In fact, von Neumann was one of the participants in the symposium.
But it seemed that von Neumann was about the only person in the audience who took in Gödel's remark.
Yes. Well, and the story that I had heard was that as soon as von Neumann got that, he changed the seminar, devoted it completely to the Gödel's theorem.
That's absolutely right. Actually, he proved, you see, when Gödel announced the result, he didn't have the second theorem yet. He didn't have you couldn't prove the consistency in the system.
No.
He suggested, and von Neumann got that independently, but by the time he wrote Gödel had it.
Oh, yeah.
Van, there's great news these days. Fermat's last theorem has been proved.
Oh, yes, of course.
Tell us what you think about Wilde's discovery, if it does pan out.
Well, I guess like everyone else, it's amazing. Amazing enough so that naturally one's skeptical for a while. The amazing thing is that various of them have finally decided that, yes, apparently it's right. They haven't turned up anything wrong with it. One always reserves the back of one's mind the possibility that someone may still, but it is very exciting to know that the thing has the acceptance now of the profession.
Yes, it is. And one may add that you yourself were involved with Fermat's last theorem, for it's a little-known fact that you discovered a set-theoretic equivalent of Fermat's last theorem, which has now apparently been verified.
Good. Yes, sure enough.
Tell us where that was, so that viewers may find it.
Yes, I'd hit upon this way back about 1932 or 3, and a proof, and it was a clumsy, boring proof using the binomial theorem and various things, so it just lay there for 50 years? Yes, 50 years, maybe a little more. And then I was putting together that book, Quiddities. So I got back into that 1932 notebook and to see what was that again that I had found, because it was surprisingly little equivalent to Fermat's last theorem in entirely different terms, in terms of sorting some objects, a few objects, into a bin of boxes of various colors. And if there are equally many ways of doing it one way, which is easily described, but I won't bother, as another, then and only then Fermat's last theorem is true. So that was just a nice kind of observation, I thought, for a book like Quiddities. And then I went at it and found a ridiculously simple proof. and it's just maybe a 10-line paragraph of prose for the lay reader.
Now, Tarski's always, for you, has played a very big role in your intellectual life and so forth. When did you first learn about him?
I expect not until getting to Vienna. That's
and then you went and studied with him in Warsaw after you studied with Kanov in Prague.
Yes. Łukasiewicz was my entering wedge. And I'd heard of Łukasiewicz. It happened. C.I. Lewis had mentioned him in his. I guess it would have been in his course on theory of knowledge, but he had that interest in logic, a certain sort, as we know, and there was something relevant in Łukasiewicz. But it wasn't because of that I thought I should go. When I was in Vienna, I found after that, in the course of that first term, that I wasn't getting logic at all. Of course, there was a great logician there, one that I knew of, and perhaps the only one there, namely Gödel. But he wasn't, it wasn't as though he were giving a course, wasn't teaching, and furthermore, he wasn't particularly outgoing, although he was friendly. I wanted to sit in on a course, and I wrote to Göttingen, and I wrote to Warsaw, had a reply from Göttingen that there was nothing being taught that semester in logic. And I wrote to Carnap in Prague. And I had cordial replies, invitations from both Carnap and, in the case of Warsaw, Łukasiewicz. So I did both of those.
Now I want to ask you not a biographical question, but still about Tarski. You know very well that there are people who are in ways very close to you, such as Davidson and Putnam, and whom you've influenced very much, who have been, certainly in recent years, critical, Putnam more than Davidson, but even Davidson somewhat, of Tarski's so-called truth definition as being adequate or sufficient and so forth. How do you view this truth definition? What do you see its point, its purpose?
Good. Yes, I
get out on the table, because here's where you do differ with Davidson and with Hillary.
Well, I see it in terms of the whole series of concepts of denotation. A one-place predicate denotes each of the things it's true of. A two-place predicate denotes the pairs of things that it's true of. It's a sort of predicate that expresses a relation. And then you have 3 and 4 and so on. Each of these can be, each of these submits to that schema, or in fact a paradigm. Boston quotes. This is the name of the name. Boston quotes designates Boston. And then take a general term like rabbit. Rabbit quotes denotes each rabbit, and similarly for the other predicates. And then here's an explanation of each of those denotation relations. And then as a zero case of that series of 1, 2, 3, etc., is truth. Truth, you might say, bringing back C.S. Peirce's term medad for a series of a sequence of no objects. A sentence is true if it denotes the medad. There's only one. At most, I qualify this from my own point of view. Then the definition of truth comes in this way. that if you have any particular language, you can, by in a definition of finite length, define denotation of the first degree, second degree, and so on, that is monadic, dyadic, triadic, by enumeration of the cases, because you only have a finite number of primitive predicates in your vocabulary. You can't learn an infinite number of them as primitive. You have to define some in terms of others. So you can do that. But in the case of truth, you can't define it that way. But you have an infinite number. Here you have the schema corresponding to all those other schemata, which brought in objects and sequences of objects. All you can say for truth is, quote, snow is white, unquote, is true if and only if snow is white. But we have infinitely many sentences, and therefore can't exhaust the cases we can for the finite or positive cases of denotation. So Tarski's trick then is to get an actual definition of truth for any particular language from a general definition of positive denotation, because all the cases of positive denotation can be systematically defined, and just exhausting the finite lexicon for that language of irreducible predicates of monadic or dyadic, or et cetera. And so by that trick, he gets a finite definition of, explicit definition of truth, despite the infinity of the objects.
Infinity of the sentences.
Of the sentences, right.
Van, what is your opinion of recent theories of truth that have been put forth, for example, by Paul Horwich, and earlier, of course, by Ramsey and Strawson, according to which the entire content of the notion of truth is exhausted by that infinite set of sentences called Tarski biconditional sentences of the form, quotes, snow is white is true if and only if snow is white.
Yes, I almost agree, but I think that there's one important qualification. It's our custom, even as naturalists, we think of there being no higher tribunal than science itself for truth. Even so, we don't say that a sentence is true if and only if science affirms it. We allow rather that science can be wrong. The scientists themselves do that, and when a scientific theory that's been accepted turns out to be untenable, we don't say, well, and then a change is made. We move from Newton to Einstein, say. We don't say, well, that used to be true in Newton's day, but it's not true anymore. We shouldn't say. It's not standard usage to say that. But rather, we used to think it was true, but we found out it wasn't. So this makes a peculiar predicate of truth, and this trait. And what does that mean? That's the sense, that's the extent to which one might say, yes, truth is transcendental. However, I think you can also accommodate this without exceeding the bounds of naturalism, simply by recognizing it as a curious and interesting twist of universal usage of language, and a particularly interesting one because it symbolizes somehow the striving of the scientist ever approaching some goal, of trying to approximate some goal, which is the truth. And I think it's a salutary idiom in that way, but it doesn't show that there is any such end of the line.
So let me get quite clear about this. The transcendentality comes in our being willing to say such things as there are in all probability, things we now think are true which aren't true, which you can't cash out for any particular. Suppose we used to think that snow was pink, but we have now found out that it's in fact white. For a particular sentence, we can get rid of, we used to think that that was true, but not where we actually quantify over sentences and say there are things that we, in all probability, that are not true, that we now think are true. Is that
yes, good. Here we're quantifying and making a existential assertion that we do not prove by instantiation.
But it's made reasonable by induction or something like induction.
Yes.
The frontiers of mathematical logic now are well beyond, to put it mildly, most philosophy students. So I wonder if you could give us some advice, or give philosophy students some advice. How much mathematical logic do you think a student aiming to work in the center of the subject in metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, how much mathematical logic do we need to know?
Good. Yes, I think I'd like to put it actually in terms of a pair, lower and upper bounds of a band. The lower one, and they certainly ought to know this even if they're going to be just teaching some offbeat branch of philosophy like aesthetics in some offbeat undergraduate college. Namely, they ought to know truth function theory and quantification theory. They ought to have command of a complete proof procedure of those plus identity. Excuse me, that's the myth. In fact, I've thought for ever since I've been teaching that that's something that ought to be required of everybody, whether he's going into philosophy or not. And then what I would take as desirable for the general philosopher beyond that would be an acquaintance with the logical paradoxes and the existential axioms for existence of sets since it's easy enough, in several alternative set theories to see just what the philosophical situation is there, how that's a matter of choosing not on any tangibly factual basis, but just considering various virtues of systems. So they should have that. Also, they should have, even in relation to logic in the narrow sense, they should have the completeness proof for logic under control, which actually what goes back to Gödel also, the completeness proof. And along with that, there's this certainly philosophically interesting Levenheim's theorem that just comes out as a byproduct practically from the proof. And they should have Gödel's theorem and some acquaintance at least with its proof, although no point in going through all the grimy details of arithmetization of logic. Maybe I'd leave it there.